My name is Carlo, and I'm the Communications Coordinator of the Warwick Economic Summit 2018. I'm honored to be joined by Professor John Taylor, the Mary and Robert Raymond Professor of Economics at Stanford University. Good afternoon, Professor Taylor, and thank you very much for your insightful speech at the Warwick Economic Summit.
Thank you.
During your talk earlier, you spoke about the Taylor Rule, a relatively simple formula which you designed in 1992 to guide monetary policy and which has had an enormous impact on monetary economics. How applicable do you think the Taylor Rule is today?
I think a rule like that, maybe not exactly the same one, is still quite applicable because it conveys a sense of strategy for monetary policy, how things evolve over time. It's not just what the interest rate should be today, but where it's going in the future, and its reaction to events is there. So it is like a strategy. I think many public policy decisions are better if they're in the context of a strategy. So that's how I think about it. It's not so much the mathematical formulaic aspect of it in practice, but for researchers, that's essential, because they can put it in models, they can simulate it, they can talk about it, they can compare it with different periods of time, and they can see modifications, because then there's been lots of modifications and changes over time with that.
During your speech earlier, you stated that, in your opinion, unconventional policies adopted by central banks in the aftermath of the global financial crisis did not work very well. What alternative policies would you suggest that central banks adopt to stimulate economic growth during a period of recession once the zero lower bound is reached?
In the US, the zero lower bound, by most estimates, was mainly in 2009, maybe into 2010. I think in those situations, it's best to use strategies like actually one defined by John Williams and David Reichauer, which is to say your interest rate will be a little lower longer than otherwise after the zero bound period is over. And that provides, I think, sufficient degree if stimulus if you need it. So that's what I would do. It's what I argued at the time. And that would mean you wouldn't need quantitative easing in the sense that it's defined. Now, I want to be sure that I'm clear that during 2008, in the case of the US, the balance sheet of the Fed expanded quite a bit as they made loans, lender of last resort loans. That's really before, to me, the quantitative easing really began after that with the purchases, large-scale purchases of mortgages and treasuries. So I'm talking about that part, not the actions in 2008. The other thing is it's hard to make quantitative easing strategic or rule-like. The estimates of its impact are very uncertain, and there's lots of different views about its impact. And in fact, there's quite a disagreement about its impact depending on what model you use or what method you use. So those are all the things that worry me about it. Plus, you have to undo it. And we're now going through a global unwinding of the policies, and that raises additional uncertainty.
During your talk earlier, you said that one never knows how economic research affects economic policy. Throughout your career, you've worked in academia as well as in the government, most recently as the Under Secretary of Treasury for International Affairs from 2001 to 2005. During your period in office, working for the government, how hard or simple was it to implement economic policies on the basis of academic research?
I think it's always hard. It's always been fascinating to me, that interface between the economics and the decision making. In many of my cases, the decision makers have been quite consistent with the views that I've been making advice, but even there it's difficult. In a democracy, you sometimes need legislation. There's always going to be different views. So I think in particular you have to be aware of communicating what the policy is clear. I mean, it's one thing to have your own idea. It's another thing to explain it to other people, to bring it in the context of a particular environment and to make it work. One of the things I did when I was in the Treasury was to set up a new currency in Iraq, and it was sort of going from scratch, and used basic economics for that. but obviously very difficult to bring it about a lot of people involved, a lot of different parties, a lot of different countries. So it's always difficult, but I think in a way it's a fascinating part of policymaking.
Today, Jerome Powell begins his 4-year term as chair of the Federal Reserve. How do you think monetary policy will change over the course of the next 4 years? Do you think we will see a move towards a more rule-based strategic Fed as you advocate?
I think we're beginning to see that in the last year or so. The Fed has released information about its monetary policy report, in its monetary policy report that has a whole section on policy rules. Chair Yellen talked about it, Vice Chair Fisher, and I think there's more moving in that direction than I've seen for a while. I don't see why that will change. There's a sense in which normalization is on the Fed's agenda. Normalization frequently means going back to some kind of a strategy that they had before. So we'll see, but I think it's promising.
Last year, Stanley Fischer, speaking at the Warwick Economic Summit about the Dodd-Frank Act, said, quote, "There are many aspects that are extremely important. Significantly reducing capital requirements would reduce the safety of the system," unquote. Are you in favor of financial deregulation, and if yes, to what extent?
I think the regulations that were put in at the time of Dodd-Frank could be sensibly revised. There's reporting for smaller institutions, which really are quite an impediment to them. Larger have a more easy time dealing with it. And I think with respect to capital, you don't want to reduce capital requirements. It's very important for safety. You could recognize that if capital requirements, capital levels are sufficiently high, that you then don't do so much micromanaging of the institutions and so much compliance reporting. So I think that's some of the proposals. If you have a sufficient amount of capital, then you have other things that are less regulation, but you can't deregulate the financial system, but you can have a more sensible set of regulations.
The S&P 500 has gained more than 300% over the last 9 years, making it the second longest bull market in the history of the US. Recently, Alan Greenspan said that he sees bubbles in both the bond and the stock markets. Do you agree?
Well, I see things that can cause bubbles. The low interest rates in the U.S. and in other countries, the negative interest rates, very unusual. So based on the fundamentals, you could see there'd be something there. We'll have to see where it shows up. I'd say just by an example, in 2003, 4, and 5, we saw very low interest rates given the circumstances at the time. It showed up in the housing markets. Nobody knew exactly where it was going to show up at the time, but it was showing up as people spoke. So you have to look for those kinds of things.
Finally, what is your outlook for the US economy in 2018?
I'm positive that the growth will improve from where it's been during this expansion, which is quite low, 2% average. It's already started to pick up. I've argued for a while that if we had a tax reform and regulatory reform, that those were things that could cause higher growth. So those, I think, will cause higher growth. Of course, there's other factors that come into play, but I think the fundamentals have improved, and if they prevail, we'll have a stronger growing economy.
And last question, how has your experience been at the Warwick Economic Summit?
Great. Fantastic. Wonderful questions, wonderful auditorium, great venue. I've enjoyed it tremendously.
Professor Taylor, thank you so much.
Thank you.